Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Surya Chum, and I'm a part of the team that brings you Random House events. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, I have the great pleasure of introducing a very special edition of One World's Ideas in Action discussion series, Read and Vote, Eric Holder and the Fight to Save Democracy, which celebrates the release of former Attorney General Eric Holder's book, Our Unfinished March, written with Sam Koppelman. Our Unfinished March is a brutal, bloody, and at times hopeful history of the vote. A primer on the opponents fighting to take it away, and a playbook for how we can overcome our most urgent political struggle. We'll be hearing more about this extraordinary book from the former Attorney General in just a bit, who is joined today in conversation with Sherrilyn Ifill, President and Director-Counsel Emeritus of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Before I introduce our speakers, I do have just a few housekeeping items to share with you. Firstly, real-time captions are available for tonight's program. To view the captions, please click on the closed captioning button on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Secondly, we love to see engagement in the chat, so please feel free to share in the chat where you're tuning in from, what you're reading, and any ideas that spark up for you during our discussion. We just ask that everyone please stay respectful. The last 15 minutes of the discussion is dedicated to Q&A with our author, who would be glad to answer some of your questions. Please feel free to pose them in the Q&A function, which can be found on the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll get to as many of them as time allows at the end of the program. This event is proudly presented in partnership with an array of amazing bookstore partners who are fulfilling book orders through this event. All our partners, I should note, are located in districts prone to gerrymandering. Many thanks goes to our partners Brazos Bookstore, Source Booksellers, Quail Ridge Books, and Tattered Cover. If you haven't purchased Our Unfinished March yet, you can do so by visiting our landing page and supporting any of our indie bookstore partners. We'll be throwing the link to that landing page in the chat. One World's Read and Vote initiative offers a curated list of books that examine the health of our society and key ballot issues from some of today's leading thinkers like Ibram X. Kendi, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Nikole Hannah-Jones, Heather McGhee, Eric Holder, of course, and others. And now I'm pleased to share a bit about our speakers. Sherrilyn Ifill is a civil rights lawyer and scholar who recently stepped down after 10 years in leadership as the president and director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, the nation's premier civil rights law organization fighting for racial justice and equality. She's a recipient of numerous honorary doctorates and was named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world in 2021. Ifill serves on the board of the Mellon Foundation and the board of trustees of New York University School of Law. She is a past chair of the U.S. board of the Open Society Foundations. And last but certainly not least is our featured author today, Eric Holder, who is a civil rights leader and chairman of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. He serves as the 82nd Attorney General of the United States, the first African-American to hold that office. Now a senior counsel at Covington and Burling, he lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife, Dr. Sharon Malone. They have 3 children. And without further ado, I'd love to invite Eric Holder and Sherrilyn Ifill to our virtual stage now, and I'll pass it over now to Sherrilyn Ifill to lead our discussion.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I'm grateful to everyone who decided to take some time out of your evening for this conversation tonight. I think it's important, it's incredibly timely, and I'm always thrilled to have the opportunity to talk with my friend Eric Holder. And we don't get that opportunity often. So even if it has to be on Zoom, I'm quite pleased that we're able to talk about the things that we care most about.
Good to see you, Sherrilyn. Always good to see you, even virtually.
Even virtually. So first of all, I just want to congratulate you on this wonderful book, Our Unfinished March, that was written with Sam Koppelman as well. I want to take a moment to just read the kind of subtitle on the cover of the book, which I think is really important. A history, the violent past and imperiled future of the vote. And then a history, a crisis, a plan. A history, a crisis, a plan. And I want to congratulate you for deciding to address all of those 3 things, right? Because we're in a very urgent, challenging, frankly, frightening and dangerous moment in our country. And we need to understand how we got here. We need to understand that history. We need to properly diagnose the crisis, right? And everybody wants to know, how do we get out of it? What is the plan? And so I want to really congratulate you on your willingness to take on that full project in this book. Now, I don't want people to feel scared off by the book. It's actually a really, really, I don't want to say easy read, but comfortable read. You'll learn some things you didn't know, but it is very, very accessible. And so I want to highly recommend it first and foremost. I want to start with this question, Eric, because, you know, I often say that the people for whom America has worked out, right? The people who have managed, you know, and their families have managed to navigate their way to some success in this country, have a special responsibility to pay it forward, have a special responsibility to our democracy. And I'm wondering if you felt that sense of urgency in wanting to write this book. You've lived a life largely of public service since becoming a lawyer. You have been, you know, more years in the Justice Department than you can shake a stick at. You've had some time in private practice, of course, but mostly it's been government service. And you know, I wonder if that's what motivated you or what motivates you to have this deep concern that you have about the state of American democracy and the work that we have to do at this moment.
Yeah, you know, I think it's precisely that. My government service, my sense of history, and the notion that many people sacrificed, committed themselves, gave their lives so that I would have opportunities that they did not. And unless we recognize that and acknowledge the progress that their sacrifice and commitment made for us, we do a great disservice to them. But I also think there's an obligation, responsibility for those of us in this generation to make sure that the future is even better. And, you know, I was raised in a West Indian household with immigrant parents who believed in this nation in a way that I think maybe only immigrants can. You know, they came from the Pearl of the Caribbean, Barbados, and their parents under dire circumstances propelled them, you know, to New York City, and they had an abiding faith in a country that in some ways they never actually experienced. They believed in the concept, the idea of America. And I think that it's incumbent upon me to try to make real that which they thought was possible. But not only, you know, in my family, you know, generations of Americans who have fought for a nation that, or the idea of the nation that they never actually had a chance to experience.
So let's begin a little bit with the history that you explore here. And I will tell you that one of the things I think is interesting about the choices you made, because obviously tomes and tomes of history could be, you know, written about the right to vote in this country, about, you know, the relationship of Black people in the vote and so on and so forth. But you've made some really interesting choices. One is, I think you walk away from your historical narrative with the clear understanding that voting has always been contested in this country in one way or another. And I'm curious about that choice. And I wonder if you just tell the listeners a little bit about, you know, a skim of a summary of kind of the history that you marched through, because I think that's actually important for people to understand. You know, as you know, Eric, I've been a civil rights lawyer for 30 years. I started out at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund as a voting rights attorney in 1988. So when people say to me, you know, how did we suddenly start having all these voting rights problems? And I say, well, yes, there is an intensity that is quite different now, but this has been around for a long time. So can you say a little bit about your choice to approach the history that way, and then a little bit about that history?
Sure. I mean, the title is Our Unfinished March. And, you know, as I think about it, in some ways, if I had a choice, I might have retitled that book to say America's Unfinished March, because it's not only about African Americans and people of color and their fight for the right to vote, which is a continuing one, and it is weaved throughout our history. I mean, start off with, you know, the first group of people who fought for the right to vote were white men who didn't have property. And they were the ones who agitated for the right to vote. During the Constitutional Convention, questions were talked about, well, who should have, the right to vote, and questions about should people without property have, should white men who don't have property have the ability to vote? Questions back and forth. Some of our founding fathers said that was not a good thing, that people, white men without property could easily be bought, didn't have the intellectual capacity to exercise their suffrage rights. But ultimately, we talk about a guy named Thomas Dorr in Rhode Island, who fomented a rebellion. Now, I'm not saying this is something we need to do, but fomented a rebellion to get white men without property the right to vote. And then for a variety of other reasons, that group is recognized. One of the things that the founding fathers said, who was John Adams, said, if you give white men without property the right to vote, other groups are also going to demand the right to vote. And this will be a never-ending, cascading kind of thing. And he was precisely right, because then women decide that they want the right to vote. And so we talk about, women, sacrifices that they made, white women as well as Black women, who in that part of the struggle are too often forgotten, that is African-American women, Ida B. Wells. And then we talk about, I think, that struggle for the vote that in some ways we are more conversant with, and that is the struggle of African-Americans for the right to vote post-Civil War and then during the 20th century. But this has always been, as long as we have been a republic, a struggle for the right to vote, and what that means to the direction of the nation, what that means for the policies that are put in place. And the struggle that we face now is that we have at least one group of people who I think are comfortable with the notion that they don't need to have a majority of the popular support in order to exercise majority power. And this is something, again, that we have seen throughout the course of our history. But I thought it was important to lay out the history, to look at where we are now, the present crisis, and then to come up with some suggestions, some solutions as to how we can finally get this country to the place where it needs to be.
And I want to get to the crisis that we're in and how you diagnose it and the plan. But I want to ask one more question about history. I thought one of the most fascinating parts of the history segment of the book was that you described the way in which the franchise was expanded to include white men without property as having been motivated by three things. And I think I'm trying to figure out how to describe them. One was the concern about military conscription. The second was race, was the concern among Southern white men that they would need the unpropertied white men to defend against slave rebellions, right? And then third was the move into the West, not the unpopulated West, because obviously Native Americans were living in many of the places that settlers were moving to, but the idea that it was a motivation for people moving into these territories that white men would also have the vote. And so assigning a kind of a citizenship to white men without property in order to achieve some very pragmatic gains. And I wonder if you could say something about that, because I feel like that's a clue, that we should be, a thread we should be pulling forward to today.
Yeah, I mean, the expansion of the right to vote, or the motivators behind the right to vote, or expanding it to white men without property, it was not necessarily something, feel good, something that was necessarily morally based. There were really practical reasons, as you said, in the South, concerns that you want to have, if you want to have people who serve in the military, both to defend us against foreign enemies, but also to keep the South safe in case there were revolts by the enslaved people, to have people move from the East to the West, and telling them, if you come to the territories, we'll allow you the right to vote. These were very practical things, very practical things that was behind that desire to make the franchise available to white men without property.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It reminds me of Derek Bell's interest convergence theory. About the very pragmatic reasons that often underlie the expansion of rights, especially for Black people in the 20th century. I want to talk a little bit about the crisis, about the moment that we find ourselves in. I have been very determined over the years not to soft sell it. And I'll say for myself that this is not a crisis that I think, has suddenly come upon us, although the intensity of it without question is extraordinary, and the danger is perhaps higher than it has ever been. But this has been building for quite some time.
Right.
And you've been in public life. You've been in the Department of Justice. You've been in politics. You've rubbed shoulders with many of the people who have been running the country at various times. And I'm curious about how you diagnose precisely why we got to this moment. Not like what happened last year, because this can't just spring from nowhere. Now that you've had some time to reflect, what do you see as the roots of the current manifestation of this powerfully anti-democratic moment and this retrenchment? You talk in the book, obviously, about the retrenchment, after Reconstruction, and how successful, in fact, Reconstruction was, and the potential of it, and how the potential of it should actually motivate us today. But how do you account for the moment that we're in now, just from your own knowledge and experience?
Yeah, I think this nation has really been on an arc that really has manifested itself and really accelerated over the course of the last, few years. But that arc is one where the Republican Party has made the determination, they've come to the realization that demographic changes are not on their side, that there are ideological shifts in the population of the United States. We're often described as a center-right country. But if you look at the largest voting bloc in the country now, which is young people, they are not, you cannot appropriately describe them as center-right. And so, you go back as before Reagan, and you hear Republicans talking about, demographic time bombs and all kinds of things that they're not going to be able to handle, that conservatism is not going to be able to handle. And they start to look at ways in which they make it more difficult for people who they believe not to be their supporters to vote. Now, you certainly have seen on steroids what happened over the course of the last, 10 years or so, from the Shelby County case, and even before that. But the Shelby County case is really something that is a prime marker. And then through the Trump administration and what Republicans have done at the state level, at the federal level, to try to keep away from the polls those people who they think do not support them, disproportionately people of color, and to give power to those people who they feel are their ideological soulmates, in spite of the fact that they might not have popular support. And that's why you see gerrymandering in not only in the South, but in states all around the nation. I mean, Wisconsin is probably at this point, Wisconsin, Texas, Georgia, those are about the three most gerrymandered states we have in the nation. And so this is not something that sprang up over the course of the last, just during the Trump years. This is something that has been bubbling, boiling, and then finally unleashed, I think, in full force through the Trump years.
You identify the Shelby County case. I know that as the Attorney General, you were the defendant, but you would prefer that we just call the case the Shelby County case and not Shelby County versus Holder. So I'll call it the Shelby County case as well. But I want to make sure that those who are listening, know what that case was about and why you regard it as, such a powerful moment that kind of shifted the state of the country. So why don't you share a little bit about that case and why that case was so alarming for so many of us?
Yeah, I mean, in the history, I talk about how, people sacrifice. We talk about, the creation of the 1965 Voting Rights Act and how that fundamentally changed the nation, and how registration rates go up in the covered states, in the South primarily, and how you see the flowering of Black political power. And then you get to the Shelby County case in 2013, when the Chief Justice famously says America has changed, and says that the coverage component of that bill, which states can be covered on what basis, he says the coverage formula is outdated, and as a result, they essentially gut significant portions of the Voting Rights Act. And that took the Justice Department to a large degree off the field, because the power that the Justice Department had to pre-clear changes that localities and states wanted to put in place with regard to their electoral systems in those covered jurisdictions, that power was essentially taken away from the Justice Department. And the results were quite immediate. It wasn't a question of, years before those formerly covered states and jurisdictions started to put in place regressive electoral measures. They did it in a matter of weeks, in fact, in matters of days. And what we have seen since Shelby County is closures of about 1,700, 1,800 polling places around the country, voter purges that are unnecessary and disproportionately in those places formerly covered by the act and disproportionately directed at people of color. A whole range of democracy measures have been put in place that I suspect would have been stopped by a Justice Department that had a pre-clearance ability. But even more than that, I suspect that with the pre-clearance ability left intact, some of these measures would not even have been attempted to have been put in place.
That's right.
But emboldened by the Shelby County decision, the states, the Republicans simply went to town. And a lot of the problems that we are facing today with regard to access to the polls can be tied directly to what I think is one of the worst decisions in Supreme Court history.
Oh, but then this term, the Supreme Court said, "Hold my beer," and the Dobbs decision. It's interesting. It's precisely what you just described about Shelby, right? That we see what the states are doing. Within weeks of the Dobbs decision, you see this race to the bottom, and it very much has the same feeling for me of what happened after the Shelby County decision, when states that would have had to get permission from a federal authority to impose these voter suppression measures, just kind of went to town and have not stopped since then. And it's only gotten worse. It's an important reminder for us of why we have to push back so hard. Right. And I will say, I remember the day of the Shelby County decision that you convened a meeting with civil rights litigating organizations and leaders in your office. Within hours of the decision, we were sitting at the Department of Justice around a big table, and you were pledging that the Department of Justice would use the resources that it had to use the other parts of the Voting Rights Act to make sure that the rights of Black and Latino and Asian American and Native American voters would be protected. And nevertheless, here we are. And it has accelerated. I have often referred to Trump as an accelerant, as a person who didn't create the conditions, but he did accelerate what we have seen and seen this unraveling. And in your book, you talk quite a bit about the issue of gerrymandering, which you regard as kind of central, really, to the question of the power imbalance and a kind of fixed and institutionalized power imbalance that gerrymandering has created in our country, and that in many ways you believe accounts for some of the excesses that we have seen and that we have been unable to stop. So I think it's important to, we use that word gerrymandering all the time. I think it's important to make sure people understand what it means for their own lives. I think very often the subject of gerrymandering sounds like something political people do somewhere in some room, and people don't really understand the ways in which gerrymandering affects their own citizenship and silences their own voice. So can you kind of share a little bit about that and why you regard it as so central?
Sure. When we formed up the National Democratic Redistricting Committee in January of 2017, in anticipation of the redistricting that we were to do in 2021, because we redistrict every 10 years after the census, and Democrats had not done a good job in 2011. The Republicans had a thing called Project Red Map. They gerrymandered like there was no tomorrow, and put in place Republican power in states around the country where, again, they did not necessarily they didn't win the greatest number of votes, but ended up with the greatest number of seats in state legislatures all around the country. And when we started talking about gerrymandering back in 2017, I could see people's eyes would glaze over and think, oh, this is political stuff, it's this ethereal, what is going on? But we had to kind of break through and make people understand that if you care about reproductive rights, if you care about protecting voting rights, if you care about criminal justice reform, all of these things are directly tied to who serves in state legislatures, who serves in the House of Representatives. And gerrymandering is a very pernicious thing where one party draws the districts in such a way that the other party, no matter how good the candidate, no matter how well funded, no matter how good the message, simply cannot win. And you do it by drawing the lines in such a way by dispersing your opponents in around the state, if you're looking at states, or you pack them into concentrated districts, all of which has the ability to give a minority disproportionate amounts of power. And so, the Supreme Court, we're all concerned about the overturning of Roe versus Wade. Well, the Supreme Court is, and I think that's a terrible decision, but the Supreme Court is dealing with gerrymandered state legislatures passing these anti-choice bills that are not supported by the people in the states from which they come. And if you go state by state, you will see, even in Texas, people did not want Roe versus Wade overturned. Now, the margins are different in Texas as opposed to New York, but in every state, people in the majority wanted Roe versus Wade held intact. But gerrymandered legislatures pass these bills, and they do things inconsistent with the desires of their constituents. And because of gerrymandering, they face no electoral consequence. You're in a safe district. The only thing you have to worry about is a primary challenge. You're not going to lose a general election. You only have to worry about a primary challenge, and that pushes people further and further to the right, further and further to the extremes, further and further into the pockets of the special interests. And in a real way, the Dobbs decision is a function of gerrymandering.
So, I mean, if I'm being really straight here, Eric, what you're describing is fundamentally an anti-democratic system. And this is where I think, the terrain gets tricky, because what I love about this book is that, like me, you're ever hopeful, and you're always saying, but we have to fight, we have to fight, we have to fight. And I truly believe that. But I do believe that the fight is directly connected to the diagnosis of what the problem is. So I'm asking you candidly, do you think that we are at the precipice of losing democracy? Because what you've described, which is, it's not about gerrymandering, is not so much about candidates and parties, it's about the people being manipulated, right? And being moved to silence the voice of the majority. And that sounds to me counter to the very concept of democracy. And maybe it's important for us to use that language because, I have been railing against describing these measures in purely partisan terms. It is true that it is the Republican Party that has engaged in this very extremist activity, but it is really a democracy moment. It is an anti-democracy moment. And I think it's important for people to understand that. Is that your sense as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The measures that I've talked about, I don't even call them anti-democratic because I get concerned that people might think I'm talking about anti-democratic party.
Small d.
The way I describe them is anti-democracy. Right. And our democracy is at a very dangerous place right now. If you couple gerrymandering with voter suppression and the attacks on our electoral infrastructure, our democracy is at a precipice. We've had a democracy, a functioning democracy, for almost 250 years with all kinds of problems, all kinds of issues. But we could lose that which we say defines America in really fundamental ways. Doesn't mean we'll have a dictator, but we could render elections every 2 years, every 4 years, every six years. We could render them almost meaningless. And people need to understand that, as John Lewis said, democracy is not a state, it's an act, and you have to constantly be fighting for it. I think back, and these parallels sometimes rub people the wrong way, but I think they're actually accurate. You look back to the 20th century in Europe, fascism rose not because fascism was strong, but because the defense of democracy was weak. And unless we defend our democracy, call out the injustices, the improprieties, the unconstitutional things that are being done, and then fight to halt them and reverse them, we are in danger of losing our democracy. And I'm not being hyperbolic. I'm not being alarmist. That is a reality that this nation confronts in 2022.
So you prescribe for this mortally ill democracy a kind of a menu of how we can save democracy. And I guess I would say I don't consider the U.S. A democracy until the passage of the Voting Rights Act, frankly, because so long as half the country can deny the vote to citizens, based on race, I don't think it's a true democracy. And that's important to me because I say it all the time. I say we're a very young democracy, younger than we even think. Yeah. And so these are some of the growing pains of a very young democracy. And what I like about the way you set this forth in the book is that you describe kind of three areas. You describe elections, which is kind of like our institutional infrastructure of elections, which I'd really like you to talk about. Then you talk about Congress, and you talk about the courts. And we really have to talk about the courts. So let's start with our institutions and what you think needs to happen in the space of how we would change our election procedures, our structures, our approach to elections to kind of reverse and guard against the kind of anti-democracy takeover that has happened that you described just a little while ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to work on kind of the infrastructure when it comes to voting. I mean, coming up with a system where we have automatic registration, same day registration.
Describe what automatic voter registration would mean. What would that look like?
Well, when you turn 18 and you come in contact with any component of your state or local government, you automatically are registered. When you get a driver's license, when you go to in any form or fashion, you come in contact with the government, or things are sent to you when you're 18. And you can actually start before that. You can pre-register people in high school when they're 17 years old. You have them as captives in the 12th grade. You have them fill out registration forms, and then they automatically become eligible voters at the age of 18. And so, doing that makes a great deal of sense. Making sure that people have the ability to register on the day of an election. Again, we have that in a number of states. We've seen no indication that there is any increase in fraud, but we do see an increase in the number of people who actually turn out to vote. And felony disenfranchisement, something that has racist roots, disproportionately disenfranchises people of color. When the voters in Florida had an opportunity to say, well, you know what, just because you committed a felony and you have completed your sentence, you've paid your debt to society, should you have the ability to vote again? Over 60%, 62, 63% of the people in Florida said, yeah, that's something that we ought to do. Republican legislature put in place measures that essentially took that ability away. So allowing people with felony records to have the ability to vote. Mandate 14 days of early voting to make sure that people don't have to make a decision on the first Tuesday in November about whether or not they're going to go to their jobs or actually cast a ballot. Make mail-in voting something that we used very successfully during the pandemic and increase voter turnout to historic proportions, and without any indication of fraud, make that something that is permanent and more widespread. So these are all the kinds of things I think that we can do with regard to just simply to voting. We can change voting structures that would increase the number of people who would have the ability to cast a ballot, and without, and I have to really emphasize this, there are no studies that show that any of the things that I propose in the book would increase the possibility of voter fraud.
So let's talk about Congress. You spend a lot of time in the book talking about the filibuster, which we've all been talking about quite a bit. So share some of what you're thinking is there.
Yeah, I mean, the filibuster is used in the Senate now to a degree that it has never been used before. our history shows that
And,
filibuster.
and in a way that it has never been, the non-talking filibuster, right? Yeah.
Right, exactly. You don't even have to raise your hand and say that I filibuster. You can just kind of call it in, and no one even knows who is behind, a filibuster. And filibusters in the past, filibusters have a really bad history. I mean, they were successfully used in the past to stop civil rights bills. And now they are used just as a matter of course. Everybody always says you have to have 60 votes in the Senate to pass a bill. No, you don't. That's only because of the filibuster and the use that has been made of it in recent years.
Which is a Senate rule, it's not a statute, it's not
Right.
a law.
No, in fact, the founders talked about whether or not you needed to have supermajorities in order to pass legislation. And the determination was made based on the problems that they had with the Articles of Confederation to simply make majority votes, the thing that would decide whether or not legislation would pass. The filibuster is something that is grafted on to our system later on and has been taken advantage of, chiefly by Republicans, in the course of the last few decades. So ending the filibuster would be something that would allow bills such as the voting bills that were to be considered, that were passed by the House of Representatives, and it would have dealt with a lot of the issues that I have described in the book, but were stopped because you couldn't get to 50 votes in the Senate and allow Vice President Harris to break the tie. Now, obviously, that was because 2 Democratic senators would not vote to for a carve out on the filibuster, and I think they should be taken to task for that. But I think we should also realize that 50 Republicans, the entirety of the Republican representation in the Senate voted against those reform measures. So ending the filibuster is something that I think that we have to do for a whole variety of reasons. And the arguments that, well, if you end the filibuster, that means that when Republicans take over, they'll have the ability to put in place measures that they want to do. Well, if they control the House, if they control the Senate, and if they control the presidency, that's kind of the way our system is supposed to work. But I think people should also remember that when they did control the House, did control the Senate, and did control the presidency, the thing that they said they were bound and determined to do, which was to do away with Obamacare, they couldn't pull off. And so, out of concern of what that would mean when they had to face voters and take their Obamacare away from them. So I think we need to have to do away with
giving too much credit. But there's a reason. If you're the minority, if you're not able to win majorities, the idea that you're going to be able to marshal that power is we shouldn't presume that.
Yeah. So that's part of what I think we need to do with the Senate. But I also think that we need to, because of the way in which the Senate is constructed, and Wyoming has as many senators as California, 700,000 people to about 38 million, that we need to admit Washington, D.C. as a state. We need to admit Puerto Rico as a state. Now that may, I think in Washington, D.C., you probably will get 2 Democratic senators. In Puerto Rico, it's not clear that you would obviously get 2 senators. But I think there are constitutional and moral reasons why we here in Washington, D.C. should have the ability to have full representation in Congress. But that would at least have, I think, some impact on the disparity that exists, the structural disparity that exists in our Senate.
So before we get to the courts, let me just pressure test a little bit the 2 things that you talked about, which is changing our election system and getting rid of the filibuster. We've talked a lot about all of the elements of the election system that you've described that could be changed. And in fact, you pointed out there was a piece of legislation last year that was in Congress. I spent lots of time fighting for it. I spent lots of time meeting with senators, including Republicans and including the 2 Democrats who were not willing to support the bills. How do we get there? I mean, you're right. You're ticking off the laundry list of all the things that we need to be able to right the ship, but we can't even get control of the helm of the steering wheel. And so I think the obvious question is, yes, we know all the things that we need that would make our voting system better. How do we get there, given the spiral that is happening right now? And just as a segue to our conversation about the courts, what the Supreme Court has revealed it is willing to do is considerably more alarming than we might have thought in the past. Shelby County was a terrible decision, but as you'll recall in that case, the Supreme Court said, yes, but you still have Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, and you can use that to litigate. Fast forward to last summer and the Brnovich case, in which Justice Alito, not at all bothered by history and tradition, not bothered by textualism, not bothered by any major questions doctrine, rewrites the test for evaluating Section 2 cases. So I want to ask a little bit about the how on those two things, on changing the election structure and getting rid of the filibuster.
Yeah, I mean, at base, we have to win elections. I don't think that we can rely on this supermajority, conservative supermajority in the Supreme Court to do the right thing. And so it means winning at the state level, winning in the House of Representatives, winning, Senate seats. We tend to, Democrats, progressives tend to focus on, get really excited, for presidential elections, and we don't participate as much as we should in midterm elections. We actually did a study at the NDRC where we have seen that people who vote for Democratic candidates will vote for Democrats at the top of the ticket, but as you go down, they will not vote because they don't know who's running for, I don't know, city council, county executive, something like that. They will not vote. They won't vote Republican, but they simply will not cast a ballot.
We call it fall off on the ballot.
Right. And you see that to a much greater degree with people who vote for Democrats and progressives than you do for people who vote for Republicans and conservatives. And so we need to elect people who will do the appropriate things once in office. We have a chance if Democrats can, progressives and Democrats can hold the House of Representatives, not an easy thing this year. And if you can elect 2 more Democrats to the Senate to do a whole range of things, and especially in the electoral field, where you could have, I think, that carve out for democracy measures, and you would be able to pass a new Voting Rights Act that would not only cover the old Confederacy, you'd have a Voting Rights Act that would cover the nation in its entirety, which I think is appropriate given the fact that the problems are now they're not confined to the old South. We see these issues in Wisconsin, Ohio.
It's metastasized, yeah. We
see them all around the nation. So we have to win elections and then pass this legislation. And then, it's almost, I dare you. It's almost an I dare you to the Supreme Court to say, all right, we have a new Voting Rights Act with a new coverage formula. We dare you to say that this new bill is unconstitutional. I don't know. I can't predict with a degree of certainty that a new bill with a pre-clearance provision, with a modern, an updated coverage formula would pass muster. I can't promise that, but I think they certainly have to be put to the test.
Eric, you represent, the Democratic Party in a variety of ways, and you're very, unabashed about that. And I'm not certainly, obviously many of the things I care about are aligned with the platforms the Democratic Party has espoused, but I'm not a party activist. And so I'm asking this question genuinely out of ignorance. You said a minute ago, we need to elect 2 more Democrats. Why not be more ambitious? I mean, having spent a year, wrangling in an effort to try to get, a voting rights bill passed, trying to get the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act passed. Why say 2? Why aren't we saying we need 5 Senate seats, or as Democrats, or as Democrats we want to get 7 House seats? Isn't that part of it? Is like being much more ambitious about power. I constantly say leave no power on the table. You got to vote for the sheriff. You got to vote for the the judges. You got to vote for the Public Service Commission members. But you also have to be ambitious. And so what do you think about that? Is that how you don't lead the party, so you can't control the messaging, but do you think that might be a better way to talk about what the goal is, particularly for this year?
Yeah, let me be, maybe I wasn't clear. I said we need to have at least 2 more senators in order to counteract, I suspect, Senators Manchin and Sinema, who are not going to change their minds, with 2 additional Democrats. we would be in a position to put in place, those pro-democracy bills that died last year. Yeah, I do think you're right. We need to be pushing for as many Democrats as is possible, because as I say in the book right now, and it pains me to say this, and I mean, it genuinely does. The Republicans just ain't that into democracy. That's one of the lines we have in the book, but that is a reality. And it sounds like I'm being a partisan here, but I'm just being real. I'm just, that is just where the parties are right now. But the point you make about power is a good one, because Democrats and progressives are uncomfortable, I think, with the acquisition and the use of power. And we need to get over that. We need to get over that. Doesn't mean we have to try to acquire power as Republicans have, or use it in inappropriate ways as I think Republicans have. But using power, acquiring power is something that we have to be a lot more comfortable with, and then exercising that power and making and trying to to move the ball forward, to make progress, and not even get beyond making progress, to get us to the place where we need to be, and that means about accumulating power and then using it.
Well, I was looking in the chat, and a couple of people are asking about the Supreme Court and what your views are on Supreme Court reform. And fortunately, you write about it in the book, and that's part of your plan. So why don't you share with those listening your plan and what you think should happen in terms of Supreme Court reform?
Yeah, a couple of things. And I was actually kind of surprised as I did some research on this. I thought that we need to limit the terms of Supreme Court justices, that serving for life gives people in unelected positions too much power over too long a period of time. If you look back in the history section of the book, you'll see that most Supreme Court justices left the court in the early part of the early history of the United States because they died. We didn't live as long as we do now. They were appointed, they died, and their successors were appointed by whoever was president at the time. Now we have people who are living, well into their 80s. They're picked when they're in their early 50s, if not 40s. With the idea that they're going to serve 30 years. And we have people who leave the court only when there is a president in office who shares their party, shares their ideological views. And in that way, we have a kind of a self-perpetuating, majority on the court, coupled with the stealing of a couple of seats by the Republicans, the seat that Merrick Garland should have had, the seat that should have been left open with Amy Coney Barrett, because she was picked while people were actually in the process of voting for the next president. So those two seats, so the court, I think, has to be expanded to deal with those thefts. Terms need to be limited to 18 years. And this is one of those instances I note in the book where the Chief Justice and I are on the same page. He says 15 years, I say 18. And I say 18 because it's coupled with something else where I would have a president appoint a Supreme Court justice in the first and third years of his or her term, so that per term, a president would appoint 2 justices to the Supreme Court. And over time, that would get us back to 9 seats. Otherwise, as I said, I think the court needs to be expanded in the short term. But if you have this guarantee of 2 justices per term, it brings new blood into the court. I suspect it means you'd have people who are perhaps a little older, have a little more life experience, who would serve on the court, and would also depressurize to some degree the confirmation process. So those are the things that I think we need to do with regard to the Supreme Court.
So and Congress has a lot of power. So Congress could expand the court, and and it certainly has the power to control how many justices are on the court, because Mitch McConnell decided that there would only be 8 for nearly a year. So obviously they have that power. But term limits is another story, because lifetime tenure is in the Constitution for the Supreme Court. Do you think there would need to be a constitutional amendment, or do you support some of the other ideas that have been out there about limiting jurisdiction and senior status and so forth as a way to achieve those ends?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that the safest way to do it is by constitutional amendment. And it's an interesting thing. There are the notion of term limits for members of the Supreme Court actually has pretty wide bipartisan support. I've really been kind of surprised by some of the polling that I've seen on that issue. And so I think there is at least the possibility, not necessarily a good one, that you might be able to get a constitutional amendment. But failing that, I do think arguments can be made that you get life tenure as a federal judge appointed to the United States Supreme Court, but that your time on the Supreme Court could be limited to, as I say, 18 years, and you would serve the rest of your life tenure in some other part of the federal judiciary. That's at least one of the theories, one of the ways in which it might be done on a statutory basis.
Do you think the Supreme Court has shown us something about themselves this term, or maybe the last couple of terms, that is kind of markedly different? I mean, it's one, there are conservative courts, and there are, there's the Warren Court, and, we have these eras in which the court has a certain kind of ideological bent. What do you think we see with this Supreme Court in the last couple of years, and how does that affect how you think about the plan?
Well, I think that
I think the Dobbs decision and the way it was done is actually quite revealing and monumentally concerning.
Oh, absolutely. I think to the extent that I had concerns about the court while I was writing the book, those concerns have only been enhanced by what the court did in this term with regard to the gun decision, certainly with regard to Dobbs, the environmental decision, and what I fear they're going to do next year with regard to Section 2, affirmative action, and most maybe, in terms of a democracy, a governmental worry with regard to the independent state legislature doctrine that, 4 justices had to somehow agree that this was something worthy of Supreme Court review. That is a truly fringe theory. There's not a constitutional scholar.
And remember, to go back to, again, the court's kind of recklessness in the Rucho case, where the court said, we're not going to get involved in partisan gerrymandering. Right. The court said state courts could handle it. and now they've taken this case in which, state courts would potentially be sidelined, and it would be left in the hands of partisan state legislatures. And it's one of the things we skipped over is we didn't get to talk about the independent Redistricting Commission idea, which is also in your book, to address the issue of gerrymandering. Yeah. So there's a couple of folks who are continuing to ask about the Supreme Court and Supreme Court reform, but I think that you've answered that. I'm curious, however, about this year, and some people have asked very specifically, what do you think are the chances for the Democrats in the House and the Senate? Just bringing your political eye to where we are at this moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that to the extent that there's a silver lining in the Dobbs case and the New York gun case, I think it has energized the Democratic base. And I think the possibility exists that this will not be a normal midterm election, that you're going to see substantially greater numbers of Democrats voting. If in fact Donald Trump announces that he's running for president before or a little after Labor Day, I think that will be something that will energize the Democratic base. And so I think the possibility exists that the House can be retained and that you can add those additional senators on Democratic senators. And I look at, Wisconsin as a potential pickup. Certainly Pennsylvania as a potential pickup. Those I think are maybe the 2 states where I see the best chances for Democrats to win, which is not to write off, North Carolina, Ohio, and other states as well, Florida. There are other states as well where I think there are a pickup possibility. So I think an energized Democratic base focused on primarily, what the Supreme Court in Dobbs, but also, the gun case could save the nation.
I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about January 6th and the violent attack on the Capitol and the work of the January 6th Commission and what it is revealing to us every week. Many things we knew or thought we knew, and some we didn't. And this feels like we are building towards a very critical moment. And, I think America is certainly at a crossroads. You said, what's the line in the book about Republicans that are not that into democracy? What I've said is that what we have been able to now see is that there are leaders across the country, some, in business, some in politics, who are agnostic about whether we're a democracy or not. And I think that's a powerful revelation for us to understand. And so I'm really curious about your response to 1/6, to January 6th, and what you think it means and meant, and the work of the commission. I happen to think they're doing a terrific job, but what do you think has to happen? I don't want to ask you to comment on your successor, Attorney General Garland, and what his plans may be, because I know that you won't say too much, but whatever you feel you can say, I think it would be important for people to hear.
Yeah, I think that we need to stop talking about January 6th as a riot or an attempt to stop the peaceful transfer of power. It was a coup attempt. It was a coup attempt, an attempt to stop the transfer of power, not peaceful transfer, to stop the transfer of power and to come up with a way in which Donald Trump, who lost the election by 7 million votes, could stay in the office of president. It's sedition. People have to be held accountable. We cannot allow that which they tried to do to go unpunished. There is an accountability component to that, I think, that is fairly obvious, but there's a deterrent component to this as well. If people are not held accountable in this, with regard to this incident, what is to stop somebody, I don't know, 2 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 100 years from now, from trying the same thing, knowing that the only punishment is, your reputation is perhaps besmirched and you have to face a congressional committee. They've done a great job. But I will say something. I mean, the Justice Department, I think, is going to have a job to do. And I think if the Justice Department is not talking about it, and maybe I should find ways to describe for the American people in to a greater degree than it has. But I think the Justice Department is looking at things. I served my first 12 years as a lawyer in a thing called the Public Integrity Section in the Justice Department, where I dealt with official corruption cases, and you get a feel for these matters after a while. I feel pretty safe in saying that Merrick Garland is going to have to make a determination that there is going to be sufficient proof to connect high-level people in the White House and Trump supporters, and I think as well as the president himself, in this coup, that you're going to be able to show that they were substantively involved, that they have the requisite intent, and the decision is going to have to be made about whether or not you are going to bring charges against them. And I actually think that you are going to see charges brought against people who are very close to Donald Trump, people who served in the White House, people who are advising from outside the White House. I think the only question is whether or not you will come up with sufficient proof with regard to the former president himself. But based on my experience as an official corruption prosecutor, I think you're going to get to that point as well. You'll show that he had the requisite substantive involvement and acted with the appropriate intent. I mean, when he says, find me 11,780 votes, that shows intent. When he tells the people at the Justice Department, you just go out there and say it's corrupt and let me and the Republican Congress do it, that shows intent. And so I think Merrick's going to have, some, and the people at the Justice Department, some tough choices, but actually, I'm not sure they are that tough, given the need to hold people accountable and the way in which we need to deter people in the future from trying what they tried to accomplish on January the 6th. If the cases are there, I think they have to be brought.
Thank you for answering that question so candidly. You heard it here first, folks. That's the former Attorney General of the United States giving his assessment of the evidence that we've seen so far. It's a powerful rule of law moment if we're to be a democracy and no man or woman or person is above the law. I think that's the moment that we're facing. Eric, we have run out of time. This was a fantastic conversation. Obviously, you and I have to talk more. There's a lot going on. The book is absolutely wonderful. Folks, go out and get it, Our Unfinished March. And you can find information in the chat. The folks at Random House have provided a link that will get you to a landing page so that you can purchase the book. I think it's really important. I thank you so much, Eric, for this conversation. I thank you for writing the book and really respecting your audience enough to give us the full story, the background, the moment, and the plan.
Let me end this way. Dr. King said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But here's the deal, and this is what the book shows. That arc doesn't bend unless people put their hands on that arc and pull it towards justice. And I've just had the great pleasure of talking to somebody over the course of the last hour, Sherrilyn Ifill, who has put her hand on that arc and pulled it towards justice through a very distinguished career. We need more people like her. But you don't have to be, the legal stalwart, the legal with the legal brilliance of Charlene Eiffel. All of us have the capacity, and that's one of the things I think you'll see in the book. So-called ordinary Americans have risen to the challenge over the course of the history of this country to meet the challenges of their time. It is incumbent upon this generation to meet the challenges of our time.
Well, on that note, we have to end the evening. Thank you so much, Eric Holder. This book is Our Unfinished March. Please go out and get it. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight.